about which therapies are the best for which people. And lastly, I'll mention PCORI, the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, which Congress graciously just refunded for 10 years, is created just to do that particular part on behalf of patients. You know, as a doctor, the most common question I got is, which treatment is best for me? And that takes comparative clinical trials that the government is very well suited to do.
Thank you. I don't happen to be a believer in this horse deworming product known as ivermectin, but it is my recollection that that is something which is actually going through clinical trials funded by the government, not by the industry. Is that correct?
That's correct. The NIH is funding two large trials right now, one of which using a network which I helped create with the NIH and this Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute. So I think we all see treatments, and I made the point in my opening statement, most of what we develop, no matter how good the science looks, turns out to have risks that supersede the benefit. Only 10% of drugs that make it into human clinical trials actually make it to market because of this problem. So we got to have an open mind, we got to do the trials, and then we have to follow the science, follow the data.
Thank you. I was made aware of a practice that perhaps you could elaborate on, which is that a product may be approved for usage by a physician, but limited in when it can be used or how it can be used. And I'm thinking with regards to monoclonal antibodies. It was related that an individual in a hospital with advanced COVID had been in the hospital for several days, wanted to get a monoclonal antibody treatment, but was told, you can't get that, we won't allow you to have that in the hospital. The FDA doesn't allow us to treat you with monoclonal antibodies, even though at the beginning of the disease, they would have been potentially effective. Later on, we don't think they are, so we won't treat you. That seems to be an awfully unfair way to deal with someone who's in a life-threatening circumstance. Is that the correct practice? Is that a correct understanding, rather, of that practice? And does it make sense? And if so, why?
Well, I'll try to be brief in the answer here. But first of all, let me just say, I followed this closely because we knew monoclonal antibodies were highly likely to be effective against SARS-CoV-2 because they worked for the first SARS epidemic, which fortunately was stopped early and never became a global pandemic. As these drugs were developed, it's an amazing effect, a 90% reduction in death and hospitalization, but most effective if used early, and that really should be the focus, and I think that's the basis for which the practices that you described may have evolved. Barely effective, if at all, in people who go, as you know, you get sick with the virus, and then a week or 10 days later, you may get sick enough to enter the hospital. By that point, there's much less effect. Now, the specific practice of preventing prescription of antibodies, I'm not aware that that's happening, but it may be, and I think that would need to be looked at in context. There are some people who don't develop an antibody response where the treatment may be effective.
Thank you. I've got more questions, but my time is up, Madam Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Casey.
Thank you, Chair Murray. Doctor, thanks for your willingness to commit more time to public service at the FDA. We're grateful for your willingness to do that. I wanted to raise at least two subjects with you. One is over-the-counter monograph reform, and then also antimicrobial resistance. But first, on the over-the-counter monograph reform, I appreciate the commitment you expressed during our meeting with regard to implementation of the reform law that was passed last year as part of the CARES Act. And I also appreciate the work and the challenges that FDA confronts with implementation. We're grateful for the steps that have been taken so far to implement the law. The law, as you know, included new tools for both the FDA and the over-the-counter industry to facilitate innovation, accompanied by appropriate regulatory oversight. This includes the user fees that accompanied the regulatory authority to enable FDA to build out a modern over-the-counter regulatory system with the necessary human resources. And I appreciate the early implementation milestones, such as the deemed administrative orders being issued. So here's my question. As this implementation continues, will you commit to the following? Number one, ongoing communication and transparency with Congress. Number two, transparency with regard to the public health and industry stakeholders.
Yes, thank you, Senator. And thank you for getting this through. It's in the world of regulation, this is pretty exciting. I mean, I personally visited the drugstore early this morning to get an over-the-counter medicine, and it was noticeable to me as commissioner last time around that we needed to do something so that these monographs could be updated as innovation is made, but we also were empowered to look at the safety of these over-the-counter products. So it's really appreciated, and I do commit to transparency and discussion with you and others in Congress.
Thanks, Doctor. Next on antimicrobial resistance, this is an issue that presents right now urgent public health challenges. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, there are more than 2.8 million antibiotic resistant infections in this country every year, causing more than 35,000 deaths. This committee has tackled this issue in a number of ways over the years, including the passage of the so-called GAIN Act, the Generating Antibiotic Incentives Now Act. That was back in 2012. The GAIN Act gave FDA new tools and provided new incentives to drug developers to encourage them to meet this urgent public health threat. Yet since that time, we've made very little progress in getting new antibiotics approved to combat these drug-resistant infections. Numerous experts have expressed concerns that the COVID-19 pandemic could exacerbate the spread of antimicrobial resistant infections. And I want to note the work with Senator Cassidy on this, been able to work with him on this and other members of the committee. What do you see as the barriers to more antimicrobial drug development, and how would you work to support that drug development within the FDA if confirmed?
Thank you for raising this issue, and while we're so consumed with the pandemic right now, we cannot lose sight of this other threat. You know, in my lecture after leaving the FDA, I gave, its safety and effectiveness of medical products, food, tobacco, and always put in preparation for emergencies. And at the time, 5 years ago, people sort of scratched their heads like, what's that? I think we all know what that means now. But we can't lose sight of the fact that we could get a super resistant bug. And if we don't have antibiotics on the shelf that are ready to go, we're going to have a big problem that will be difficult, if not impossible, to treat. This involves a whole variety of things, one of the most important of which is One Health, the combination of animals and human evaluation, because many of these resistant bacteria develop in animals that are treated with antibiotics. But in addition, there's what you mentioned. We have to have a system of developing antibiotics, essentially not intending to use them, because you want to hold them in reserve. And there's several mechanisms to do that I would look forward to working with you on. One pathway you've already passed in Congress, and that's in motion now, but we're going to have to do a lot better, or we may be taken by another surprise, and we don't want another one like the current pandemic.
Thanks, Doctor.
Thank you. Senator Braun.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dr. Cahill, enjoyed our conversation in my office not too long ago, and we covered a broad array of topics. I've been interested in reforming healthcare in general to add transparency, competition to it. FDA specifically, I think we did cover some discussion on making it more agile, especially on maladies that don't have really good treatments out there. And you said you'd be amenable to that, and I like to hear that. This is a question I've asked since the origin of the COVID kind of navigation, and now we got a lot of data. We're lucky that we did have warp speed. We got the vaccine done. Looks like with variants, there are going to be renditions of it that we still need to tackle. Whether vaccines will be the only leg that we use. I've been a believer that it needs to be broader. The subject of therapeutics. Are you willing to put the same interest in developing therapeutics, especially in light of the fact that some either choose not to get it for the wrong or right reason? Where does that fit in your opinion, in terms of the relative importance, especially given the fact that it looks very difficult logistically. We'll get the world vaccinated in a way to suppress variants. How important are therapeutics, and where will you be, your posture, in terms of promoting that second leg, if not a third one down the road, in terms of protecting you against it in the first place? Focus on the therapeutics.
You know, I'm a cardiologist, so we're fairly well known in the medical community as being aggressive people with regard to therapeutics, and I think it's made a huge difference in heart disease that we have drugs and devices, many of which I've worked on in my career. And I think the same holds here. Vaccines are far and away the first line of defense, in addition to the behavioral measures that we all know about. But for people who are unlucky enough to get infected, particularly those that are high risk, the therapeutics are absolutely essential. I already made the point with Senator Romney, the therapeutic antibiotics have a 90% effect, and now it looks like we have oral antivirals that may also be in that category. But we got to stay on top of this because the virus doesn't really care about us. It's mutating constantly, and we got to have platforms that will produce therapeutics just in time for the variants as they come up. But so therapeutics is a big part of the FDA. It's a big part of my history, and I will definitely work hard on this.
So I think from what you said there that you're willing to acknowledge that it's going to have to be a significant part of how we tamp this down over time, and I'm glad to hear that. Another question I have. Under your leadership in 2016, the FDA weakened the risk evaluation and mitigation strategy on protocols on Mifepristone, hard to pronounce, but a drug that's used early in the stages of when you're entertaining an abortion. Recent study analyzed 423,000 taxpayer-funded abortions between 2002 and 15. And I've got a question. Do you think that we need to be in that relaxed kind of interpretation of that particular approach? Or is this something you're going to listen to current information and technology on so that you give a full kind of consideration of that particular methodology on abortions?
Well, as I've already discussed with Senator Burr, I do appreciate the question. There is a document filed by FDA in court about the evaluation of the data on Mifepristone, and the reevaluation is imminent. I'm not involved in that particular reevaluation, but I can assure you the staff will be looking at the latest data and applying the best science and make the best possible decision. I have confidence in that staff, and I know them well.
And I think that's in the context of what we're seeing, even with what the courts are taking up in terms of trying to get to the proper balance on Roe versus Wade, and that issue is going to be out there. And I think to many Americans, it's an important, including the question I just asked. Madam Chair, I ask unanimous consent to submit for the record the testimony of an individual that experienced complications resulting from a chemical abortion drug.
Without objection.
Thank you.
Senator Murphy.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Dr. Califf, thank you for your continued willingness to serve the country. I'm going to submit two questions for the record that I hope you'll take a hard look at. One on the continued delay in regulating medical gases. This is something that there's bipartisan interest in. The current regulatory system just doesn't work for medical gases. And we'd love for you to take a look at how we can expedite that process. And second, a question for the record on the issue of counterfeit medical products. We're thinking about bipartisan legislation here that would provide some new authorities to crack down on counterfeit products. We've obviously seen a disturbing growth in the distribution of counterfeit devices during the pandemic, PPE and testing kits at the top of the list. But the two questions I'd love to have you answer in person are on mental health drug development and drug shortages. On this question of mental health drug development, it is pretty stunning, the sort of slow pace that we've seen of new and transformative drugs in the mental health space. Right now, there are some products in the pipeline, like for schizophrenia, but overall, relative to the need, we aren't seeing enough new innovative products come forward, and that has to do in part because of the complex patient populations that we're talking about here that can make research and clinical trials and data collection more complicated. You've written about the need to streamline the clinical trial process and the opportunity for digital technology to expand people that can participate in trials. Do you think that that reform can help unlock more research and more clinical trials for individuals with behavioral health needs?
I mean, the short answer would be yes, but I would like to give a slightly longer answer. I won't take too much time because this is an area of great passion for me and experience. I don't think people in America realize enough that before the pandemic, we were experiencing an unprecedented reduction in our life expectancy in the U.S., largely driven by the opioid crisis, that is addiction, and also by suicide, in addition to common chronic diseases often driven by people who are in despair and not taking the best care of themselves. And we also haven't talked enough about the fact that in addition to the disparities that we all know of, with up to 10-year difference in life expectancy according to race and ethnicity, we have an enormous urban-rural issue in this country with a rapid decline in life expectancy of people in rural America. I don't see any way to connect to everybody in America except through digital technology, but it should be supplemented by people on the ground who help people deal with digital technology in the local community. So I see this as the way forward. We started a drug addiction program in Dayton, Ohio, where the highest mortality rate per population was occurring. And in that Take All Comers program, the ability to use telehealth to reach people in rural Ohio has made an enormous difference. So that's a longer answer to say, yes, let's get on it. We need to do something about this.
Well, and I appreciate that answer. I want to make sure that we are focusing on more widespread and traditional behavioral health disorders, not simply on addiction, where we need drug development and discovery in both. But it's still pretty stunning that in the area of treating depression today, we're living in a trial and error world. We still lack the data necessary to be able to know with the kind of certainty we'd like what drugs are going to work right off the bat. And a lot of patients have to try and fail on multiple therapies before they find the one that works. And so I look forward.
I've led my own number of failed clinical trials trying to develop new treatments for depression specifically, and also for anxiety. So we've got, I completely agree, we've got to address these very prevalent mental health conditions directly.
Quickly, on the issue of drug shortages, in 2012, the FDA Safety and Innovation Act gave FDA new tools to address drug shortages. And I just want to make sure that we're looking into the future where we might have increased tensions with countries that are critical to our drug supply chain. Do you think that FDA has the authorities it needs to really think 5, 10, 15 years down the line to look at shortages that may result based on changes in our relationships with economic allies?
Senator Murphy, I really appreciate that question. And let me just say, I was serving on the National Academy of Medicine Supply Chain Committee, which is due to produce a report any minute now. I can't reveal what's in the report, but let me just say, I don't think people are aware of the tenuousness of our current supply chain. We have to have transparency and build in resilience, or we're going to be at risk. And in fact, if you talk to hospitals and medical practices, it's already happened that we've fallen short of critical supplies periodically. So we really need to work on this.
Senator Cassidy.
Hey, Dr. Califf, nice to see you.
Great to see you.
From afar. I'm told that I was out at another committee hearing, but I'm told that Senator Sanders asked if you support negotiation and you agreed. Now, do you think that the FDA has a role in this negotiation? Let me first ask you this.
No. We were a bit short on time, so I was trying to compress my answers. I mean, I have a published record saying I think negotiation is a good idea, but that's not the role of the FDA. So that's the answer.
That's fine. I also want to associate myself with Senator Casey's remarks about the work we're doing on antimicrobial resistance, and I thank you. I'll know you'll be very aware of that. And how do we come up with ways for these necessary antibiotics to somehow have a business plan which works? So just to mention that as well.
I really appreciate your help with that. And I remember in 2016 sitting there with all of the relevant agencies, and you're trying to keep track of the microbial underpinnings on a global basis because we're all connected. And you know, it's a great place for big data if you love the science, but we have got to figure out how to get a handle on this.
You had mentioned in a conversation we had prior to this that I had raised the issue, and I want to follow up on it just to set the stage. We know that on complex generics, if I remember my term of art correct, that, for example, the EpiPen, that you could change whether or not you turn the device to the left or to the right, and that would give a lease of life of exclusivity upon the product. So Dr. Gottlieb had suggested, your predecessor, to allow equivalency between, okay, you don't have to turn it left or right, it can still be considered the same product, but with alternative instructions. You had mentioned great idea, but that FDA needed tools to allow that to be implemented. We didn't follow up in the conversation. Is there more you want to say to that?
I would just say, you know, it's going to take a little work for me to get completely up to date on all the current tools that are at our disposal. But your point is so well taken. I think you and I agree that what we want to reward is innovation and creating new things that make a difference in people's health. People should do well if they do that. But having legal tricks that extend patents and reduce competitiveness, I just don't think that's a good idea under any circumstance.
How long would it be until you think you could come back to this committee with recommendations as to how we can address those legal tricks to give FDA the ability to offset them, if you will?
Well, I hesitate to give a specific time, but it should be short. I mean, I'm not ignorant on the issue, and we had a good list in 2016, but I think a number of those things on the list have already been taken care of, like the buying a generic company to prevent the competition from occurring. I think these things you all have already helped with, so I want to make sure I've got the updated list. It should be fairly, very quick, I would think.
Next, thank you. I look forward to that. Next, we had spoken again offline about the accelerated pathway and, you know, how the Biogen drug for Alzheimer's obviously addressing a need which is devastating, but there's a lot of concerns about efficacy, safety, and cost. And you had mentioned using big data in order to have a quicker answer on drugs such as this. I'd like you to elaborate on that, please.
Sure. Well, you know, we have essentially 300 million plus Americans with electronic health records now. Our health data is being used all the time in clinical practice. A lot of my career has been on the issue of how do we use that data, organize it, curate it, make it useful for research. It sometimes startles people when I say the data is good enough to use in clinical practice, as you well know, but not good enough for research. And people say, wait a minute, how can that be? That it's good enough for me, but not good enough to draw a conclusion. I think we're well down the road now in having a functional system, but I also want to assure people, I'm not talking about willy-nilly analysis of data. I'm talking about well-planned studies, frequently the use of randomization. And if we look at the UK during the pandemic, that's what they did. They organized as a country. They took on the big questions, and they've answered a lot of questions very succinctly with the advantage they don't have to spend a ton of money collecting what's already in the electronic health record.
Let me ask you, do you need different rules that we have to give you, or can you do that with existing authority?
I think the FDA has adequate authority, but I think the system, because this takes many players, CMS has to be involved, the private health sector has to be involved, and I think the most important thing is to develop a system that gives Americans trust that their data can be used, not for someone else necessarily, but for their own benefit. I mean, if I had a heart attack today, I would feel a lot better if I knew how all the other people like me had fared with the different treatments. And so it's in my interest to share data, but we got to develop, I think we do have work to do to develop a system that Americans will trust to allow this to happen.
I look forward to your further thoughts how to develop that system, and I thank you for your vision. I yield.
Thank you. Senator Hassan.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair and Ranking Member Burr, and I want to thank our witness and your family for your willingness to serve. Dr. Califf, I want to return to the topic of opioids. In 1995, the FDA first approved OxyContin, as you have acknowledged, a very powerful opioid drug. Since then, more than 500,000 people have died from opioid-related overdoses. In 2020 alone, over 357 Granite Staters in my home state lost their lives due to opioid overdoses. And tragically, many people first became addicted to opioids through a legal prescription for OxyContin or other FDA-approved drugs. First question, did the FDA make a mistake when it approved OxyContin in 1995?
I think if we look back, approving OxyContin with no long-term studies and no assessment of the addictive capabilities is something that could have been done differently.
In 2001, the FDA revised the OxyContin label to indicate that the drug should be used not just for short-term pain, but when a, quote, continuous around-the-clock opioid analgesic is needed for an extended period of time, close quote. In other words, the FDA specifically indicated OxyContin for long-term use to treat chronic pain. Former FDA Commissioner David Kessler, who led the agency in 2001, has since said that there are no studies on the safety or efficacy of opioids for long-term use, and has called the FDA's 2001 decision a mistake and a, quote, blank check, close quote, for the industry. Do you agree with that assessment?
Well, the only little part of it I disagree with is there are now long-term studies underway, but at the time he said it, I think that it was accurate and it could have been done differently. I mean, I'm an evidence-based person, and if we're going to instruct people to take drugs for long periods of time, we need long-term studies.
Well, look, it's an old adage, but it is worth repeating. The first step toward fixing a problem is admitting that you have one. Repeatedly, I've asked FDA officials about this, and I get this kind of vague answer about whether the 2001 relabeling was a mistake. And its failure to admit to having created problems for more than 20 years is part of why we have an opioid crisis in the first place. And it's still troubling to me that we don't have direct acknowledgement by FDA and FDA officials that they made mistakes, and that in 2001, the decision to relabel created an even worse problem. Let me just move forward to one other thing. You became FDA Commissioner in 2016. By that time, we did know an awful lot about the addictive nature of OxyContin and the problems with the label from 2001. Why didn't you take action to change the OxyContin label when you led the FDA in 2016?
Well, what I did was to several things. One is to support these long-term studies that needed to be done to get the evidence, and also contract with the National Academy of Medicine to reset the format for the evaluation of opioids. The tradition at FDA is to evaluate risk and benefit for the person for whom the drug is prescribed. This affects many other people in society, and that was successfully done. So I do believe it has set the framework for that.
But doctor, when you listed, in response to Senator Murray's question, when you listed what we need to do going forward on opioids, you said we need to reassess some things, we need more prescriber education. You cited your own family's experience with getting a 30-day prescription for opioids for minor surgery. If the label were different, the doctor wouldn't have prescribed that family member the 30-day prescription. So explain to me why we shouldn't aggressively be pursuing relabeling.
I think as the evidence comes in, we are going to need to aggressively look at relabeling. That was the purpose of setting a different framework, so that we'd have a legal framework for doing that.
The evidence has been here for a long time. It's the evidence of thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people dying in this country. It's the evidence that I see when I go to the funeral of a constituent who has been in recovery multiple times and has relapsed. It's the evidence that I see when I go to the funeral for that constituent's sister and listen to the mother who has lost 2 adult daughters to this illness despite their repeated attempts to enter recovery. There is plenty of evidence about what we need to do about this epidemic, and the FDA needs to take the lead. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. We have 3 votes on. I'm going to go vote and turn the gavel over to Senator Burr. The next 2 senators will be Senator Tuberville and Senator Smith.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Dr. Califf, for being here today and bringing your family and being a part of this and continue to wanting to serve at such a tough time in our country. Very quickly, state of Alabama. We've lost people in our state because of testing. We don't get to them quick enough in the rural areas. What's your suggestion on that?
Well, I mean, we've got to make tests available and either free or low cost, and they need to be readily available in the person's home. There's also just a tremendous amount of education that we need to do to make sure that people are aware that when they have symptoms or when they think they've been exposed, they should get tested because of the extreme risk, particularly if they're high risk. And in the rural population, as I've already stated, there's a huge amount of common chronic disease that really means that we have a lot of high-risk people in the rural areas. And then I wouldn't understate the critical importance of education programs for the primary care practices in rural areas. You know, these folks are overwhelmed and incredibly busy, and we got to catch people early on because these treatments that we talked about are highly effective if used early.
Yeah. While we're on that subject, what's your thought about this new pill that they've come out with? I forget which company, this new therapeutic that they're saying is very effective.
Well, you know, there's a saying, in God we trust, all others must bring data when it comes to the FDA. So the press release is out, I think, this morning on something that looks really exciting. And there's every reason to believe that a direct antiviral should work because it works in other viral diseases. So I really look forward to the FDA's evaluation of the actual data, which I think is going to be done very quickly, just like the other therapeutics. And you know, the idea that if you're unlucky enough to get infected, let's say even if you're vaccinated, the idea that there's a 90% effective treatment is truly exciting.
In my former job, the last 10 years of my 40 years of coaching, I'd bring players in, and more each year, higher percentage of kids would come in taking drugs. You'd bring 25 in. 20 years ago, there might be 1, maybe 2 that taking insulin or something like that. Now, you bring 25 in, half of them are taking attention deficit drugs like Ritalin. I think we're overprescribing these drugs. I think we get them involved in drugs at too early of an age. What's your thoughts about, you know, these mental health drugs that Senator Murphy was talking about?
Well, I think there's sort of a Goldilocks thing here, you know, not too big, not too small, and we got to find the right place for each treatment, for each type of problem that people have. And the only way we really know that is to do the clinical studies, get the evidence, and then we know what the risks and benefits are. Too often with children, we've not had the right evidence early on, and the docs are guessing, the prescribers, it may be a nurse practitioner, guessing about what the best treatment is. So, I mean, my answer to this, we've got to double down on getting the evidence. We've talked about some of the ways of doing it already this morning using electronic health records and such. Once we have the evidence, if someone's prescribing, I think in the example that Senator Hassan said of the opioids, if someone's prescribing a bunch of unnecessary stuff, we need to have a system that deals with that effectively. So I think almost all the drugs on the market, you know, the drugs have been shown to be effective for an FDA-approved indication, but when they get out beyond those indications, we've got a lot of work to do to get the right evidence.
Thank you, Dr. Califf.
Senator Smith.
Thank you very much. Dr. Califf, welcome to the committee and welcome to your family, and thank you for your willingness to serve again as FDA Commissioner. And I appreciated our conversation of a couple of weeks ago, I think it was now, and just want to say I particularly appreciated your commitment to advancing equity. I think that is a matter of such great importance. I want to follow up first, though. I'm going to try to touch on 2 or 3 things. I want to follow up first on a question that Senator Murray brought up, touching on how we can get more rapid COVID-19 testing to the market. You know, as COVID-19 becomes more endemic, affordable, available, and in-home rapid testing is going to be so essential. And the FDA has taken steps to streamline the review process for authorizing COVID-19 tests, including rapid tests. Some policy folks are arguing that we should be reclassifying rapid COVID-19 tests as a public health tool rather than as a medical device, and that this would help to increase supply and reduce prices. So I'm wondering if you could, Dr. Cardiff, could you, based on your experience, what do you think about this idea? What do you see as the downsides? And what more do you think that we could do to speed up the supply and lower the price of rapid tests at home?
Well, that exact solution, well, first of all, thanks for the question. I think you may not have been here when I mentioned my son Sam back here got a rapid test yesterday because he wasn't feeling too good after his booster shot, and it was negative. So I fully personally appreciate the impact of having availability of rapid tests. But that specific solution, I don't think it solves the problem. It may be one pathway. I'd have to study it. But what I do know, I started my career evaluating cardiovascular tests. This was in 1978. It was a long time ago. But the principles are the same, and the purpose of the test is really important. A test to screen for a disease, a test to diagnose a disease, a test to determine the prognosis, what's the likely outcome. The operating characteristics that you measure are different, and we do need to have a system, and I know Senator Burr and others are working on this. Now we need to have a system that takes these different purposes into account. Just like with a drug may have a use in several different indications, and the dose may even be different in different indications. So we got to have a flexible system that takes these things into account, and an evidence generation system that makes sure that when we're using it for one purpose or another, we actually understand what the test result means.
So if you're confirmed as FDA Commissioner, will you commit to reviewing the current process for authorizing tests and take steps to streamline this process, and make sure you'll let us know if there are things that we need to be doing here at the committee to support that effort?
Yes, I would very much look forward to working with you on that. It'll actually get back to where I started my career, so I'd find it in a nerdy sort of way pretty exciting.
Thank you. That's good. Dr. Califf, while the FDA doesn't set the price of prescription drugs, the FDA has significant power to bring more low-cost generics and biosimilars to market. This has been a big priority of mine. In fact, the first bill that I introduced when I came to the Senate is a bill to prevent parking of, the parking situation that we have. In fact, this is a bipartisan bill that I have with Senator Braun, and it would prevent generic manufacturers from and name brand manufacturers from gaming the system and help to streamline getting that generic drug approvals done. Could you talk a little bit about how you would use the tools at your disposal at the FDA to prevent anti-competitive behavior like parking in the prescription drug market?
I think I've already mentioned in 2016 we had a long list of ways that pharmaceutical companies could extend the patents or otherwise get around the intended move to generic status after an appropriate period of patent exclusivity. And I think there's no other way than making a list, and it's a little bit like whack-a-mole. You have to, they're really smart people on the other side looking for ways to circumvent the rules. So you got to be on your toes, and then in some cases, FDA has distinct power to make a difference, and in other cases, it would involve something that we would need from Congress to help take care of it, as in the case that you mentioned. I'd also mention, I'm very aware in the supply chain issues that we've got to shore up the generic supply chain while we're also reducing the costs, and that's a big issue we need to pay attention to.
Absolutely agree with that. In the interest of time, I'm going to submit for the record my final question, which is around how to address the need to include more pregnant women in clinical trials, and I'll submit that question to you. Thank you.
Thank you. I will just take a quick second and say that is, I work very hard on including children in clinical trials, and that's work. It's getting better and better. Pregnant women is a big frontier. It's a very high-risk situation. Everybody, is concerned. But if we don't do the studies, we end up with, like my daughter, who I mentioned had congenital heart disease. I have a granddaughter sitting back here too, But you know, when you have a chronic disease, you need to take medicine for it, even if you're pregnant. We have almost no studies that address those issues. So I would really look forward to working with you on that issue.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Collins.
Doctor, I was very pleased to hear you say twice this morning that your first priority is improving emergency preparedness so that we're better able to counter the inevitable next pandemic that comes our way. As you know from our discussion, for a number of years, I've been very concerned that the United States drug market is increasingly reliant on the manufacture of active pharmaceutical ingredients at facilities overseas. In fact, the FDA in 2019 testified that 72% of the facilities that manufacture APIs are located overseas, a lot of them in China and in India. In addition, we know that China has virtually cornered the market on manufacture of antibiotics. I'm very concerned that we see, as we saw with India, when there is a pandemic like COVID, that countries begin to hoard medicines that were destined for our market. So I strongly believe that part of reforming the medical supply chain has to include incentivizing manufacturers using both carrots and sticks to locate their facilities in the United States, starting with the 100 essential medicines list. And perhaps we could link it to participation in the VA health program, for example. Perhaps tax incentives are needed. What are your thoughts on our vulnerabilities in the supply chain?
Thank you, Senator Collins, for the question. And as I've mentioned already, I served on the National Academy of Medicine Supply Chain Committee, which is about to come out with its report. So I don't want to say too much about the specific recommendations there, but your facts are correct. And in the discussion I just had with Senator Smith, the active pharmaceutical ingredients are not just for innovator drugs that we think about, but also for generics, where often we don't have enough competitive entities in what's become sort of commodity business. And so we need a number of steps to make the system more resilient. Purely onshoring is probably not the complete solution, but it's a part of it that's significant. But we need the supply chain to be secure and resilient in multiple directions, and a transparent system for knowing where things are in the supply chain, which we currently don't have. I'd mention one other thing. Manufacturing in place is an exciting technology that people have been working on, and the idea that you can make a pill now with a small machine in a local area is something that I believe is coming, and we need to accelerate that as quickly as we can.
In 1997, as a new senator, I founded the Senate Diabetes Caucus, which my colleague Jean Shaheen co-chairs with me now. And it was after meeting with children with type 1 diabetes and their parents. And in the years subsequent to that meeting, there have been many advances in technologies such as continuous glucose monitors and far better pumps and a closed system, but there still is not a cure or disease-modifying therapy yet approved for type 1 diabetes. This year, the FDA has reviewed and held 2 advisory committee meetings for therapies for type 1 diabetes. One's a biologic that may delay the clinical onset of type 1 by as long as 3 years in those at high risk. The other is cellular therapy made from donor pancreas for those who suffer from severe hypoglycemia. In addition, there have been press reports that claim an individual has been cured from type 1 diabetes as a result of new therapy. how would the FDA, under your leadership, continue to foster cutting-edge science at the various centers we have created for type 1 diabetes therapies and devices?
Well, thank you for that, and let me just say that it is exciting. These two types of diabetes, which are different in terms of their origins, and the idea that you could cure a person with type 1 diabetes, which has been a lifetime consignment to insulin therapy up until now, is very exciting. And so I think we'd like to continue this very healthy relationship between the patient community, the industry that makes products, and the regulators who have to determine if the products are safe and effective. And let me just point out, I think this is actually a paradigm. Multiple myeloma, which my mom had, or cystic fibrosis would be other examples, where when you have an activated patient community with a group of families that are dedicated, it creates a very different situation where investment comes into the area. People think of new therapies because they know that people are going to participate in the clinical trials, and the turnaround in getting the evidence is quick. And then when practitioners go to treat the disease, they can have confidence they're doing the right thing because they have strong evidence. I would frankly love it if more people copied that model, and it bothered me a lot at FDA when I would work with diseases that had no effective advocacy because they couldn't benefit from the kind of things that you created.
Thank you.
Senator Rosen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you, Dr. Califf, for being here and for your willingness to serve. We really appreciate that. I want to go over telehealth and remote monitoring for a minute because, of course, as we've seen throughout the pandemic, telehealth has become more important than ever for improving access to care, especially amongst our rural and our underserved areas. It's critical that agencies work together, like you said, to ensure coverage, payment policies, regulation of technology to keep up with the pace of innovation. So like with telehealth, home monitoring equipment has rapidly changed and become an important tool for addressing a range of conditions away from the doctor's office, from diabetes, like Senator Collins was talking about, to heart disease, which you're an expert in. It's also become a popular tool for people to monitor their own health, the health of their children, through smart devices like their smartwatches. So if confirmed, what would you do to clarify the regulatory pathways for manufacturers of such devices and products, specifically to ensure that they are both consistent, efficient, safe, just make sure they're really doing what they're supposed to and maybe helping to promote care, but not in place of care?
Really appreciate that question, and it is a passion of mine. I mean, cardiology basically goes back to measuring all kinds of things about people and then designing interventions that work. And you made a couple of really, really important points. First, we are seeing this decline in life expectancy that I've already talked about dominantly in rural America now, and it needs to be dealt with. There aren't going to be enough nurses and doctors to go to every community and provide the care that's needed, so we've got to employ digital technology. But it also can't be digital technology alone. And I would just put forward, this is not the FDA's purview, but I would put forward that the workforce that people needed in the communities to help people interact with digital technology, now that you all have graciously passed the law that will fund broadband for all of America, that's a great place by which people in rural areas can get employment. Then with regard to the regulation, this is a complicated area. And I can assure you that people who have not dealt with patients and the issues in health can make really bad mistakes in the use of technology because they haven't seen what happens when the technology is misused and someone is hurt and badly damaged. And so safety is an issue here just like everywhere else. On the other hand, if you are too heavy-handed in the regulation, you're impeding a field where essentially, with traditional devices, you make a change and you go all the way back to the manufacturing plant. With software, you just update the code, much like we're all used to doing with our iPhones. So there's a spectrum here. There's a Center for Digital Health in the FDA, and Bakul Patel, who runs it, I have tremendous confidence in. And so I think, we'll have to work across that spectrum. But I would echo more than anything else what you said about it's a human interface issue not just a person using the technology, but they're going to need a workforce that can help them use it.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up because broadband, of course, I worked on that in the infrastructure bill, and that's really important. And workforce, how do we potentiate the telehealth, all the opportunities we have? But as you talk about coordination, I know it's not the FDA's purview, but what could you do maybe differently than you might have done in the past now with, of course, technological changes we have to improve the coordination between FDA and CMS and work, like just to, and of course Congress, to be sure that all of us are moving forward in the same path to provide outcomes that are great for people. It's their health, right? We want positive outcome.
You know, I think one of the greatest lessons from my previous time as commissioner is that it's something already new, but you know, you have to experience it to realize we're all just people. And I was reflecting back on Senator Hassan. I've certainly made a number of mistakes, and we've all made mistakes. One of the elements that comes into play here is that the coordination across federal agencies is a lot more human and complicated than you would think on the outside. And so, you know, I was surprised to see the defense mechanisms that exist across the federal government that we need to break down. And so I very much learned a lot, and I really look forward to working with the HHS family and also with Congress to solve these kinds of problems where, you know, if we think about the FDA has an essential, critical, well-defined role, but if we ran it like a relay race where we just threw the baton down and then the next person had to pick it up and figure out where to go, that doesn't work. And so we do have distinct roles, but those interfaces are absolutely critical.
Yeah, I think you're right. We have to work concurrently on all of this instead of maybe consecutively, like you were saying. I see that my time is up. Thank you so much. I'll submit the rest of my questions for the record.
Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Marshall.
Thank you, Chairwoman. Dr. Califf, welcome, and again, thanks for visiting with me one-on-one, and we appreciate your willingness to put your life out here in front of all of us. Ranking Member, my good friend Senator Burr spoke a little bit earlier about real-world evidence. June of this year, I thought there was enough evidence for boosters that as a prescribing physician myself, I would have recommended it, and I did recommend it for my parents and for senior citizens and probably people with health care risk. So in June, I thought there was enough real-world evidence, but it was fall by the time the FDA moved on it, and really November before my parents were able to get it. I saw the Delta wave coming, and if we could have got those boosters in senior citizens' arms this summer, we would have saved tens and thousands of lives. How can we move more quickly with real-world evidence with a drug, a vaccine that's already had FDA clearance, but just a new use?
Well, let's dream a little bit, but I don't think the dream is far away if we get the human aspects of this right. There is no technological limitation now to having immediate access to all of the transactions that are occurring in our health system, the treatments that people get, the conditions that they're diagnosed with, and their outcomes. But we have a labyrinth of information that needs to be knitted together to make that happen so that we have information in as close to real time as possible. You've seen an approximation of this with the COVID tracker that we all look at every day that shows us almost in real time the number of cases, the hospitalization rates, and the death rates. And so it's very much, if I'm confirmed, part of my agenda to get the rules in place, the systems in place, as I have discussed, to give people confidence that it actually is in their interest to share data. But for that to work, we got to have those rules right, and those who misuse people's information need to be severely punished.
Okay, thank you. If I think about the last 20, 30, 40 greatest miracle drugs that have come to fruition in this world, maybe all of them have a relationship to the United States. What would the international price index, if that was instituted in this country, or a Medicare price negotiation, any type of price fixing by the government, what would that do to innovation in our world of drugs?
Well, Senator Marshall, I'm not sure we'll completely agree on this one, but let me just say that I do think that there needs to be, wealthy countries need to share in the cost and in paying their fair share for drugs. I'm sure you agree with that. And so, you know, in any kind of negotiation that occurs, if we go too far, it will squelch innovation, but we've got to find the sweet spot, which I would argue is a little bit off right now, because I'm acutely aware that, for example, almost a quarter of cancer patients end up not following through on the chemotherapy because they don't have the financial means to pay for these effective drugs. And people think of cardiology, my specialty, as sort of nuts and bolts, bread and butter, but it turns out financial toxicity is now a significant issue for patients with cardiovascular disease. So I do think we need an adjustment to find the sweet spot, but I also think other countries need to pay their fair share.
Thank you. RU-486 is a drug I've never prescribed as an obstetrician gynecologist, but unfortunately I've had to take care of patients with complications from it, typically in the emergency room. These patients not only have physical complications, hemorrhaging and bleeding, but certain psychological challenges after they've had that abortion, this kind of remorse afterwards. And I'm very troubled by HHS's casual attitude about prescribing RU-486. Are you committed that that should be in the hands of physicians and prescribers and not handed out like candy?
Well, as we've already discussed, I think the FDA has to make its decision based on the latest data and the scientific principles. And as we've already discussed also, I know more information is soon to become available. I'm not involved in those discussions, but I do trust the FDA staff to make good decisions.
Okay. I guess I got time for one more. I was frustrated last year that the FDA moved really quickly on some testing for coronavirus, but not on T-cell testing. As a clinician, I just want to have the choice, the ability. I don't want the FDA to decide for me whether I should use the T-cell. I just want to, if it's safe, it's available. What can you do to make sure that the FDA going forward is not choosing winners and losers? And why wouldn't you prioritize the T-cell every bit as much as some of the other testing? It just felt like that became a political turmoil rather than trying to do what's best and letting clinicians decide.
You know, when I came along in the 1970s, cardiology was really exciting, and immunology was this evolving field that was just amazingly complicated. It was really hard to understand. We've come a long way, and there's no question that T cells, I mean, if we think about it, the B cells now protect us from the acute infection, particularly in the nasopharynx with the pandemic. The T cells that's what's called into effect in the long term to prevent death and hospitalization. So I'm totally with you that we need to have T-cell testing, but it's also, without going, you know, into laborious detail, and it's not my area of expertise, let me just say that it's complicated because just measuring something in the blood of someone doesn't give us the information we need, because the T-cells have a memory, and when they get the right stimulus, they swing into action and create an army of T-cells to come in and do the job. So I would just say, I know the FDA is interested in this. I personally think it's a critical issue that we need to continue to work on, but we have to have reliable tests that give us the information we need, and maybe the combination of evolving tests and the real-world evidence that we've talked about will give us the information that we need.
Thank you so much. I yield back.
Senator Lujan.
Thank you, Chair Murray. Doctor, we've seen a new record high of opioid deaths, with more than 100,000 Americans dying over a 12-month period. In New Mexico, these numbers mean a loss of a loved one from overdose every 14 hours. The FDA has a long track record of approving dangerous opioids without considering public health. A federal judge presiding over county and state cases against opioid manufacturers and distributors recently wrote, quote, "It is accurate to describe the opioid epidemic as a man-made plague 20 years in the making. While courts are holding opioid manufacturers and distributors accountable for their actions that caused this epidemic, it's clear that the FDA missed clear signs regarding the risks and benefits of opioids, which created the crisis to take hold." In response to a question around the role of the FDA, about curbing the use of dangerous and addictive prescription drugs, you responded one of those answers is better prescriber education, which I agree with. The question that I have is, Doctor, will you commit to reevaluate the labels?
Well, Senator, I am committed to do a comprehensive review of the status of opioids early in my tenure, like in the first few months, should I be confirmed. That would include everything, including the labels. Now, I would look forward to talking with you about the details of the issues that are involved in doing that, but I am committed to do a comprehensive review of the opioid situation, including the labels.
I think that in your testimony you also shared that a family member that received a 30-day supply for an acute issue, had there been more accurate labeling requirements, I don't think that would have happened, in addition to the education. And I think that's one of the important changes that must take place. Another area that I raised when we met personally as well is the FDA convenes an advisory committee of scientific experts with a matter of significant public interest, especially is involved, highly controversial or in need of a specific type of expertise. 2014, the FDA approved Zohydro, which is a pure hydrocodone drug, despite the FDA advisory committee strongly voting against approval in a vote of 11-2 due to the known dangers of overdose and death. It goes back to what that judge said. A crisis 20 years in the making that's man-made. My question is, as a person that would be in charge of the FDA, if your advisory committee or one of the FDA advisory committees voted overwhelmingly, like this, 11-2, on Zohydro, what would you do?
Well, as I've already said, had the long-term studies been done and we had the evidence, I think that decision would have been different. It was not the right decision in the context that it was in. With regard to advisory committees, I think we had a good discussion about this, and I actually went back and looked. It turns out the FDA makes a decision that's not identical to the advisory committee about 25% of the time, but 3/4 of those 25, it's for a more stringent reduction in the use of a product instead of more use. So I think when there's an 11-2 vote, the leaders at FDA really need to take a close look and make sure they've got it right.
Doctor, if I could interrupt. I appreciate the evaluation looking at the FDA. I'm talking about opioids, and I'm talking about constituents that are dying and mistakes that the FDA has made one year after another. I'm sick and tired of the United States approving one opioid to fix another.
Yeah.
It's the dumbest thing that I don't understand it. This is stupid. People are dying because of it. Heroin, if I may, heroin didn't get developed out on the streets. It was developed in a lab by a pharmaceutical company. And then here in the United States, we keep approving one after another. Specific to an 11-2 vote on an opioid, doctor, what would you do if you got that vote on something specific to this with Zohydro? And subsequent to that, the FDA approved more without even going to the advisory committee. They just said, oh, we're going to ignore them. And I'm going to continue to approve these opioids and kill more people across America.
What would you point out that I wasn't there at that time, but in my leadership role, we instituted a mandatory advisory committee, and and also the framework of societal consideration. There are almost no opioids coming through the FDA now for approval. It's really been shut down, and I think the roles that I played were critical in doing that. But I think, I can't argue with your points.
And Chair Murray, I have several other questions for the record, especially around non-addictive pain therapies, which I think we need to be doing more about. And I do look forward to following up on that line of questioning. There must be more done here in the United States about taking this issue seriously, rather than companies and families making billions of dollars and building empires off the deaths of our constituents and our families. It's just not right, and something's got to change. And I'm hoping, Doctor, that you can be that person. Thank you, Chair Murray.
Let me assure you, if I'm confirmed, I'm going to take a very aggressive approach on this, and I appreciate your concerns.
Thank you. Senator Scott.
Thank you, Chairwoman, and thank you, Dr. Califf, for spending some time with us today, talking about some really important issues that we could all spend a day talking about. I only have 5 minutes. Good news for you. So my first question is that you're coming into a very important position in the midst of really headwinds in the public health space, and I appreciate the enormity of your responsibilities if you are confirmed to lead the FDA. How do you view the FDA's role in granting emergency use authorization for the new as well as repurposed products to address the COVID-19 pandemic? Should the FDA use a wider latitude to ensure multiple avenues, for instance, drugs like budesonide, as well as COVID-19 testing kits, making sure that they're available to combat the pandemic?
Well, as you know, thanks, Senator. It's good to be here with a fellow South Carolinian. I'm wearing my South Carolina bow tie today that my dad had. So
I'm just glad it's not Clemson, but continue, please.
Hey, I'm a Clemson man. But
I know, I'm just joking.
You're well aware, and it was during my tenure that the EUA guidance was written, that the potential benefits need to be weighed against the potential risks. That's the authority the FDA is given. And so there's a lot of latitude on the types of things that you mentioned. Yet I would still point out we do need to have enough evidence that we can make a fair assessment of what the potential is. And we need a system in this country, as I've emphasized over and over, that produces the evidence more quickly. Because under that framework, it's possible you could get it wrong. It's different if you've actually measured the benefits and risk and then you're confident about it. And so it's finding that right balance that's really in play for the FDA.
No doubt. I would suggest that based on the severity of the challenge in the public space, that taking the appropriate calculated risk, it seems to be necessary nowadays more than it has been in the past. And I think we can do that in a way that involves coming to good decisions consistently. On the front, long view of public health, I am excited about the role that the mRNA played in bringing the vaccine to the forefront and saving millions of lives. What's the future of that technology for future needs in the vaccine arena, number one? Number two, I think about the 7,000 rare blood diseases that have very few therapies, treatments of any sort, and I focus a little bit more on CRISPR technologies for things like sickle cell anemia and that path going forward. Do you see more application for CRISPR in the rare blood disease space, and B, on the future forefront of the mRNAs and vaccines, is that future as bright as it appears it could be with the use of these technologies?
Well, this is one of the things, Senator, where the excitement of being part of this is what keeps me going and coming back. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when the Human Genome Project was just being developed, and now we have the code for the genome.
Yes.
And what you're describing are the downstream consequences of that, with reading the code and producing proteins and other substances that determine whether we're sick or healthy. And there are a whole array of technologies, specifically for mRNA. I think as a platform for vaccines, this is something that we've only dreamed about, but it's a reality now. And this took a collaboration of FDA scientists and, of course, academia and the private sector all working towards a common goal over decades. But you also mentioned CRISPR, and the ability to change the fundamental genome is an amazing possibility, but also has significant risks. And so, like everything else, we got to come up with the ideas, try them out, and measure things and see what really works. But almost nothing could be more exciting than curing a rare genetic disease with a gene substitution, perhaps for life. And I think for people with sickle cell disease, I've done a lot of work, NHLBI, with Gary Gibbons, who's a great leader there. I think this is something that's really needed, and it ties in. Chronic treatment for sickle cell disease is not going so well in this country because many of the patients live off the beaten path of the big high-tech centers, and yes, we've got to get treatments that are more effective.
Yeah, and Chair, if you allow 30 seconds.
Yes, we have several more senators and votes going. So
thank you very much. So I would just say that I think we should at least take a second and thank Dr. Francis Collins for his work on the project that really has produced amazing results for our nation and frankly for the world. His work, I know he's retiring or just retired. His work has been amazing for all of mankind, number one. Number two, I would suggest that as we look into that future, the ethical issues around the new technologies like CRISPR will continue to pop up around the world. I know that China has had some challenges already with the use of CRISPR, and so what becomes a solution also becomes a problem. That's called reality, and hopefully we'll wrestle with those ethical issues in the public forum sometime in the very near future.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Senator Baldwin.
Thank you, Chair Murray. I appreciated the chance to visit with you in advance of this hearing, and I wanted to raise an issue that we discussed when we met, the misuse of dairy terms on non-dairy products. It's an ongoing problem, and it is unfair to dairy farmers and processors in Wisconsin and across the country. The American Academy of Pediatrics has called attention to the misuse of dairy terms because of the potential of these improperly labeled imposters to suggest false nutritional equivalency to milk. I've been working on this issue for years, and I'm very glad that the FDA has been moving forward toward providing the industry an updated regulatory guidance. Dr. Califf, if confirmed, you will have the ability to right this wrong, which is a product, frankly, of FDA's lack of action enforcing its very own rules. Will you commit to finalizing guidance without delay and providing a fair outcome that preserves the use of dairy terms for dairy products and that resolves this matter once and for all?
Yes, thank you. I mean, there's almost nothing more fundamental about safety than people understanding exactly what they're ingesting. So I am committed to making this a priority if I am confirmed.
Thank you. At the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, our nation experienced a critical shortage of donated blood. As one effort to alleviate this shortage, I led many of my colleagues in urging the FDA to update its outdated and discriminatory policies that unnecessarily restrict blood donation by gay and bisexual men. I was pleased to see the agency answer our call and shorten the deferral policy for men who have sex with men from 12 months down to 3 months. This is certainly a step in the right direction, but any policy that singles out an entire group of people rather than focusing on an individual's personal risk is unscientific and, in my opinion, wrong. We've come a long way in our ability to screen blood and tissue, and the science no longer supports the use of these restrictions. Will you commit to working with me to ensure that the FDA's donor policies are based on individualized risk and not rooted in stigma?
Short answer is yes, and I'll just point out that I was an intern at University of California, San Francisco when the epidemic started. We didn't know what it was until 3 years into it, and so I understand the origin of this, and there were problems with the blood supply at the time, but we've come a long way with the blood supply, and I'm fully aware that there's a study underway to look specifically at individual risk assessment, and I'll pledge to bring this home as quickly as we possibly can as this study results come in.
Thank you. I know the FDA has been working overtime to evaluate a large number of e-cigarette pre-market tobacco applications. And I'm encouraged that the agency has set a high bar for flavored e-cigarettes to be authorized for sale in the U.S. But I'm concerned by reports that companies are taking advantage of loopholes in the law and switching from making e-cigarettes to making flavored synthetic nicotine products. These products are increasingly popular, and they continue to be targeted to our nation's children. As FDA Commissioner, how would you work to address the rise in youth use of synthetic nicotine, and will you commit to working with Congress to ensure that the FDA has the authorities and resources it needs to crack down on these addictive products?
Yes, and first let me just say, as Senator Burr pointed out, Mitch Zeller is retiring as head of the Center for Tobacco Products, so appointing the right person in that job is absolutely one of the most important roles at the agency. And secondly, this is not limited to children. I may have some family members using synthetic nicotine. I learned as I was going through the paces here. And what people don't realize is that there are two enantiomers of nicotine, one of which is not occurring in nature that are in this product, and its properties are not known. So we've got to close this loophole so that we make sure that we understand the risks and benefits and particularly deal with the issues in children.
Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Hickenlooper.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Dr. Califf, thank you for your public service, and enjoyed our conversation last week. I hope I wasn't too hard on you. Let me start with a fact that the United States and New Zealand are the only two countries that permit television advertising for pharmaceutical companies. Last year, the industry spent about $4.5 billion on these ads, and I think there's a number of studies that show that the soft music, the gauzy scenery, does soften and can distort a consumer's ability to carefully evaluate the impact of the drugs. Do you think that the FDA needs to take more active role in ensuring that there's oversight, sufficient oversight in this type of advertising?
Yes, Senator. First of all, let me just point out, I got one Colorado taxpayer sitting behind me here, and another pair back home in Colorado who couldn't make it to the hearing, so much appreciate that you're here and they're here.
Let's forget the questions. We'll just go to compliments.
But yes, and I would go beyond that. I mean, I'm a doc, and I think if you ask docs, as this has been done, none of us like the fact that there's advertising of drugs, but we don't make those laws, so the FDA has to regulate it. And I think we need an across-the-board update and a much more active FDA in terms of getting the right information. It's right there in the mission statement of the FDA to make an understanding of the science behind medical products and their use for the public. But it's not just advertising done on TV like we used to seeing. There's a huge amount of information going on social media that we're going to have to deal with. So as I've talked with 23 of you folks, part of the message is if I am confirmed, I'm going to be very aggressive in this area of medical misinformation, because one could argue that it's killing more people than any particular disease right now.
Wow, that's very sobering. We talked a little bit about global clinical trials, that we have a number of international partners that are doing critical work around the efficacy of drugs and risk versus benefit. Clearly, we could save money and accelerate getting to the final conclusion on a number of new innovations and new inventions. What can the FDA do to collect data from interconnected clinical trials from our global partners? In other words, what more could the FDA be doing?
Yeah, I'm really excited about this. It was in 1988 that I did my first global clinical trial. It was the amazing invention of the fax machine. Actually, this is before the internet was available. Students these days have a hard time actually understanding what that means, that there was no internet. And we could enroll 40,000 people in cardiovascular trials in dozens of countries overnight almost. And we need to get back to that, because fundamentally most people want to volunteer for research if they can do it. And what we've got to do is to use digital technologies to interconnect people better, curate the information more effectively, and much like, as I've mentioned, the UK did in COVID with their recovery project, we should be able to reel off clinical trials very quickly that are representative of the population and get the answers that we need with larger populations. And I think the FDA can lead the way. It needs to work, as we mentioned with Senator Romney, in conjunction with CMS and, of course, the NIH.
Right, absolutely. We're seeing also a crisis now, I think, and COVID has only exaggerated what already existed. But as you say, the misinformation that's out there in social media and in the regular media as well, around not just prescription drugs per se, but around the FDA's role. And I think we discussed a number of the movie treatments and television episodes around obviously the opioids and the issues there with the Sackler family have been well covered. But it's a larger question of mistrust between FDA employees going in and working for the large pharmaceutical companies and back and forth. How do you go about rebuilding people's trust in the system?
Well, you know, trust once lost is hard to regain. That's an old statement, and I think it's true. We're going to have to be much more aggressively outgoing and work on every single aspect of transparency that we can. Again, if confirmed, I do think as a 70-year-old person with nothing to gain, I think through most of my career, I've done a pretty good job of calling out other people when they need to contribute. So, I mean, a key element to me is that the medical profession and the nursing profession, health systems, we all need to work together to build trust where the evidence is solid and show that we should be trustworthy. It's one thing to say we'll have a PR campaign about trust. It's different to show that you are trustworthy. So if confirmed, I would really look forward to working on this because, as I said, this may be, you know, we have a lot of great medical therapies now, but if people get the wrong information and don't take advantage of them or take things that don't work or are dangerous, we've really lost the game at that point. Communication is absolutely critical.
I appreciate your candor. I yield back.
Thank you. Senator Burr, any final comments?
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I think we've exhausted all the questions of committee members on my side. Let me take this opportunity to publicly congratulate and thank Francis Collins for his leadership at the National Institute of Health. He will be missed and can enjoy retirement. He's a little bit older than you, Rob. Can enjoy retirement.
If I could, Senator, let me just say, I mean, one of the regrets I have, if I'm confirmed, is I had so much fun working with Francis Collins. He's smart on a lot of areas where I know nothing, and I like to think I contributed something more in the clinical areas to his knowledge. So, but I hear he's going to be in the area still working in his lab, so he'll still be available for consults.
Well, I'm sure Francis will make himself available. As it relates to you, I believe you bring a unique skill set at a pivotal time in global innovation. You faced questions on many subjects today, and I think all would agree that you have a daunting job in front of you, if confirmed. Let me summarize that what we need right now is leadership. Leadership that is transparent, leadership that is displays a trustworthiness by not just people in the industry and in government, but by consumers, by the American people. I think you're well prepared to provide that type of leadership. So, Madam Chairman, I encourage my colleagues to support the nomination of Rob Califf and to do that as expeditiously as we can.
Thank you very much. And as we end this hearing today, I do want to make clear Mifepristone has a strong track record of safety and effectiveness, and when it comes to women's health, I do expect FDA's decision to be made based on science, just as I do all of FDA's decisions. So, Dr. Califf, I will be watching closely to make sure decisions are governed by the data, not by politics. And I do ask unanimous consent to submit for the record a study published in the New England Journal of Medicine on the safety of Mifepristone. With that, I will end our hearing today. I'd like to thank Dr. Califf for joining us and all of our colleagues as well. I look forward to working with you to make sure FDA continues to uphold the gold standard and put science and data first and keep families across our country healthy and safe. For any senators who wish to ask additional questions, questions for the record will be due Wednesday, December 15th at 5 p.m., and the hearing record will remain open for 10